I didn't want to self-destruct. The evils of Lucy was all around me. So I went running for answers.
We are here as part of the Just Communities webinar series for 2024. My name is Suzanne Burns, and I am a part of the Partnership for Southern Equity and have the pleasure of directing our Just Growth portfolio that houses the Just Communities initiative. If you are new to our work, welcome. We're really excited to have you join us today. We have an incredible speaker here to share some wisdom and truth with us. And so I'm going to hit a couple of quick sort of orientation notes, and then we're going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Dr. Dori Tunstall to speak with us today. So if we can go ahead and get our slides started. The mission of the Partnership for Southern Equity is advancing policies and institutional actions that promote racial equity and shared prosperity for all in the growth of metropolitan Atlanta and the American South. While we find that Atlanta and the South are really our home, we are increasingly having great opportunities to do work and engage with folks around the country and even outside of the U.S. Who are embracing some of the same shared values and principles that we are bringing to our work, and we're excited to grow this global community. Next slide, please. Our work is really about disrupting systems of structural inequity and racism. And we see that work has to happen in a really intersectional way. The topics that we have developed programmatic efforts and subject matter expertise around at our staff that is based here in Atlanta are around energy, growth, land use and development, health inequity, opportunity and economic inclusion, equitable economic development, around community organizing, around use of data and research to continue to help support the need for solutions. We have a Just Solutions team that is our fee-for-service arm. We have been a partner in lifting the Justice 40 Accelerator program or initiative as well, which is a broader national initiative we encourage you to check out. And we have a really important, robust part of our organization called Yes for Equity that is helping to bring youth leadership into all of these different dimensions of our work and help to build power for youth. And we want to increasingly see more and more youth faces among us in our community and in our work. Next. So hopefully you all are aware of our launch of the Just Communities initiative this January. We were building towards that over a couple of year period as we transitioned the work of eco districts into a new body of work that builds on that practice. So if you were part of the eco districts community and you're just now joining us for work on the Just Community side, welcome. We felt that it was really important in the sort of rebirth of that work to ground it in principles related to racial equity and climate resilience. So I won't read all of these to you, but know that there is an opportunity to sign up on our website that is justcommunities.info, where you can find out more about the principles. You can download a copy of the Just Communities protocol, which was released in January. And expand your practice and become a more engaged advocate for racial equity in your work. Next slide, please. And this is the cover shot for the protocol. Again, it's available for download on our website at justcommunities.info. And hopefully will be a source of some good inspiration and really practical resources and supports for you in your work. Now I have the pleasure of getting to introduce Dr. Tunstall today. I'm not going to read the full bio. You have this information in front of you, and I am between you and her wisdom. So I'm going to just highlight a couple of points that we wanted to make sure you took away. She is the renowned author of Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook. And we hope that you will all seek that out and download that and learn more and build those practices into your work. She was the first Black and Black female dean of a design faculty anywhere, and she's had that distinction at the illustrious OCAD University, the most comprehensive art, design, and media university in Canada, based in Toronto. And in all of her work, she has had the opportunity recently to take that impact beyond academia and launched Dori Tunstall Inc., a firm dedicated to decolonizing and diversifying institutional processes for companies and organizations through corporate education, executive coaching, and strategic consulting. So lots of ways to engage with Dori beyond this conversation, and check out the work that she'll have, a new piece published in Fast Company in the next couple of weeks, it looks like. And with no further ado, I am going to step back and ask Dr. Tunstall to take the stage, and we'll pull down these slides so she can share her screen. But welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I am super excited to be in community with you for me this morning. But let me start with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I occupy lands originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tatavarium, Serrano, Kush, and Chumash peoples. I honor and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship over the lands and waters that I engage with every day. I'm going to introduce myself in a different way. So I'm Elizabeth Dolores Tunstall. I am daughter of Teresa and Joseph, daughter of Raymond and Letha, granddaughter of Dolores and Johnny, granddaughter of Betty and George, great-granddaughter Katrina and Raymond, and descendant of other ancestors known and unknown. Ashe. I was actually born in Columbia, South Carolina, on the lands of the Catawba, Pidi, Chicora, Edisto, Santee, Yamasee, and Chicarawa Comal nations. And I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, on the lands of the Kickapoo, Kishkashia, and Miami nations. And so welcome to Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook. I always want to give a shout out to the amazing design team for the book. So the illustrations that you'll see, the presentations are from Anna Agi, who's a Nigerian Canadian illustrator. The book cover was designed by Sadie Redwing, and this Mandela motif is her work. And so she's a Dakota graphic designer. And then the book's interior is by Polymode Studio, which is a Black-owned and Indigenous-owned design company based bi-coastally in North Carolina and in California. So shout out to my team. So people ask me oftentimes, like, okay, what is decolonizing design about? And in some ways, they're often looking for a definition. And even though I've been a professor, I don't do definitions per se, because definitions always lead to argumentation and debate as to what's the right definition, what's the most proper definition. What I talk about is meaning, because meaning can be have many different perspectives. It can mean different things to different people. So when I talk about decolonizing design, I don't seek to offer a definition, but I want to talk about what it means. And what is meant for me is putting Indigenous first, dismantling the technology bias in the European Modernist Project, and I'll talk about that, dismantling the racist bias in European Modernist Project, making amends for harms through more than diversity, equity, inclusion, And always the money question, which is, how do you pay for all this? Reprioritizing existing resources in order to decolonize. And so the book is organized around these 5 things of what decolonizing design means to me. I'm going to only talk to you about 2 of them, putting Indigenous first, and then dismantling the racist bias in the European modernist project. The first chapter really gets to the heart of what's at stake in terms of decolonization. And the second one addresses where does design fit in helping to, again, bring more diversity in the stories of making to how we think about design as a practice. So what might decolonizing design mean? As I said, for me, it was learning about putting Indigenous first. So I've lived in many different places. Again, I'm multi-generational African-American, as I sort of laid out in my ancestral acknowledgements. And I've lived in Australia, I've lived part-time in Ethiopia, I've lived in Canada, I've now moved back recently, well, actually almost a year ago, back home to the United States. And in all those places, I've had to understand what is my positionality in relationship to Indigenous communities. In Australia, Blackness and indigeneity are actually conflated. So actually yesterday I was speaking to Dr. Brian Martin, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander colleague, and we were talking about the fact that the shared solidarity around notions of Blackness that I bring as an African American and he brings as an Aboriginal person. Again, I've been to Africa and tried to understand Blackness in that context, indigeneity in that context. And I came to Canada, and one of the things that I realized is that I had to put Indigenous first. And in fact, actually, a colleague of mine, we would meet bi-weekly for lunch, said to me, the thing you need to understand, Dori, is that relationships in Canada are oriented between red and white, whereas in the United States, from your experiences, you're going to be more used to it being black and white. And at the time, they were talking a lot in Canada around like BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and POC. And for me, it was a bit confusing because I understand the history of the term POC. So in the 1970s, there was a convention on women. Black women had put up the list of all the things that they would sort of need. Other women saw that list and said, hey, these are the same things that we need. So they came up with this term of solidarity, women of color, and then it's been expanded across genders for people of color. So I came into the Canadian context asking, like, how are you going to take Black people outside of like POC? Like, we were part of the formation of that whole entire term. And what they explained to me is that in their experiences and thinking that the experience of being Indigenous, the experience of being Black, and the experience of being people of color, which in this context means people who, again, maybe of Asian heritage or Latinx heritage or Middle Eastern heritage, that they have kind of different relationships to the state. And what I realize is that, they have actually different relationships to the land. So there's a wonderful essay called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and Kay Wang Yang. And in that, they talk about the triad of positionality in a settler colonial state. So settler colonial state is a state that was formed in which, let's say for the last 500 years, it's mostly been Europeans left Europe, got on boats and later planes, comes over to another land that is inhabited by a group of people, through a process of genocide, mostly. Whether intentional or unintentional, so diseases decimated indigenous populations up and down, North, South, Central America, and then intentionally in order to build a good life on the land. So they settle and colonize the land and settle and colonize the people. So in a settler colonial state, you have the native positionality, which are the original custodians. You have those who've been enslaved and brought over, in the case of the last 500 years, mostly Africans, to provide excess labor. And you have settlers who, again, have those who have come to build their life on their good life on the land that belongs to the indigenous people. In the essay, they're very careful to not ascribe those positionalities to specific groups, but I found it very useful to do that to help me understand what is it that they were talking about, again, in terms of being indigenous and Black and POC, and why those categories were separate. And the separation has to do with your relationship to the land, and then your relationship to the settler colonial assimilationist policies. So indigenous identities, they are in the positionality of native to the land, the original custodians. They have also been enslaved. And in this context, they have fought assimilation for over 500 years. There are the identity of Blackness. Again, they were Africans who were enslaved and then brought over to the Americas. So their positionality is slave. Again, their relationship to the land is they're involuntarily brought. So their intention was not to come and build their good life on the land. They were involuntarily brought and was brought to the land as excess laborers to work the land. And because of structures of white supremacy, they are never to be assimilated into the settler colonial state. And then you have people of color who, again, their relationship to the land is often they've left their homeland to come to places like the United States or Canada or Mexico or South America in order to escape colonial violence and destruction there and build their good life as settlers, and sometimes they've also been brought as slaves. And they have to, in many ways, make difficult choices as to whether they will assimilate into the settler colonial state based on the privileges of their skin color, their education, the wealth that they come with. But they seek to operate as a buffer against Blacks in terms of maintaining the structure of white supremacy. So I lay this all out because we all have to figure out what is our positionality in a settler colonial state to indigenous sovereignty. There were different strategies that were put in place. So Vine Deloria Jr., in his wonderful set of essays, Custer Died for Your Sins, he has this section called The Black and the Red. And he talks about that in the settler colonial state, like the white man systematically sought to exclude Blacks from all programs, policies, social events, economic schemes. Again, with the Indian, the process reversed. Because they had this history of treaties and agreements, the Indians were subjected to become white. So laws were passed, as he says, with Congress with one goal: the Anglo-Saxonization of the Indian. So that means our positionalities are quite different. And understanding our positionality becomes really important because, let's say, in the context of an African-American culture, we talk about justice in some ways as like 40 acres and a mule. And decolonizing design does not mean 40 acres and a mule, because we have to ask ourselves, from whom were those 40 acres coming, right? From indigenous people. And so in that sense, we have to understand our positionality, because in our desire, let's say, as a Black community for reparations in relationship to the land, we become part of the oppression of Indigenous communities. And so we have to understand our positionality, and to understand what strategies we need to put in place to be in solidarity with the Indigenous struggle for self-determination and the right to be back in relationship with the land. And this is, it's not easy to do. Like I talk about all the times my failures in putting Indigenous first, because we all live again in these structures that tell us, oh, you know, this is the way in which we should do things. This is the way things. So, for example, I struggle sometimes with not being present. So this is an image of Pueblo children from Zuni, New Mexico, who had arrived to the Carlisle Indian School. Residential schools were established both in the United States and Canada as part of the assimilationist project of Indigenous people. So they were stripped from their communities, they were stolen from their communities, forbidden to speak their language, they were taken out of their clothing and regalia, their hair was cut, all these things in order to, again, assimilate them into Anglo-Saxon culture. In Canada, there are lots of cultural competency workshops that are held that are really focused on understanding the impact of the residential school. So like in 2015, the Canadian government had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked at the residential schools and came out with 96 different things that they were required to do to address the harms of this. Now, part of that are these cultural competency sessions where you learn about the residential schools. And I remember attending one and feeling so impacted, triggered, right, is actually the correct word, because that story of dispossession, the story of removal from the family is very, very deeply, deeply ingrained in histories as African Americans, right? So stories of being sold away from your family, stories of, again, not being able to practice language, which is why English is my first language, right? To not be able to practice religion, which is why I think it's something like 87% of African Americans are Christian. So this was so resonant to me that I had to step out of the workshop, which in that moment was me not putting Indigenous first, disconnecting. And it manifests itself in other ways where at OCAD, we had an Indigenous Education Council. I was a member of the council, and they had really long deliberation processes. And I ended up not being able to continue because I actually just had a lot of impatience, right, with that process. So part of my failures is in putting Indigenous first is just not being present. And I have had to work really, really, really hard to not center myself, to be in solidarity with Indigenous struggles as a way to reaffirm, again, my positionality and support. The failures that I still fail with in putting Indigenous first is colonize, time, and task. So again, I spoke a little bit about not being able to have the patience to follow the Indigenous processes of consensus building, because I am known as a person who gets things done. Like, so this is a Gantt chart from a project that I did. So I'm the person who establishes the Gantt chart. I'm the person who gets the trains moving on time. I am the person who again gets things done, and I'm deeply awarded and rewarded for my capacity to get things done. But that doesn't always work, right? And the one example is there was this project called It's My Future Toronto, where we were bringing together lots of different teams from all over the world to support Indigenous, Black, and POC youth participating in design. I met this wonderful person, Camille Usher, who's Indigenous heritage. Wanted to bring her onto the team. We had a great conversation about her contributing to the project. And then it's a thing where I sent out the Gantt chart and the lists, and I said, hey, sign up for the things that you want to be able to do. And it was crickets. So again, I sent another email later saying, hey, Camille, these are some of the things that are kind of happening with the project. Would you help us connect with Indigenous youth leaders? Can you help us in the process of out like what our land acknowledgement is going to be? Crickets. I then ran into her in another meeting and event and just sort of say, hey, can we schedule a call to talk about kind of what's happening? Because I'm sending these emails. And then we sit down and she explains to me, and I start saying, hey, this is what needs to be done. And I pause because I'm listening to her silence. And I'm like, I did it, that thing, didn't I? And she just nods her head. And that thing is that, oh, I gave her all the quote unquote Indigenous tasks. I didn't recognize, and I didn't recognize that she was extraordinarily busy. I didn't recognize, I didn't listen to the silence in the sense of saying, don't just send an email, let's set up a conversation and a call. Again, do things in a relational way. And we then were able to talk about it, right? Again, all the things that I did wrong in terms of putting Indigenous first. And we actually still have a really great relationship. She's on the board of another board that I'm on. But she didn't do that project. And she didn't do that project because I was operating under this sense of colonized time and task. And I wasn't listening and building relationships. But again, because I understand, and she is generous in understanding that we will make mistakes. It's how we make amends that's important. That, again, she and I today have a really great working relationship. So understanding putting Indigenous first, understanding that we will make mistakes, but we also have to make amends, gets me to what is really, really important about decolonizing design, which is that we need to be designing objects, environments, etc., that can transmit liberatory joy to the body and to communities. Liberatory joy comes from connection. So again, that sense of what colonial structures do, what settler colonial structures do, is try to separate us from nature, try to separate us from each other, right, through this hierarchy. And so liberatory joy is about things that we do to bridge that connections, reconnect to our body and reconnect to our communities in order to connect to other communities. And so by doing the work to put Indigenous first, we address that first separation, the separation of Indigenous people from their lands, the separation of Indigenous people from their language and culture, so that we have a model of how to reintegrate and reconnect with ourselves and our communities. So key takeaways in terms of putting Indigenous first is figure out your positionality vis-a-vis Indigenous sovereignty over the land. Learn the colonial histories of the places where you are. Know that you're going to make mistakes, but you also have the opportunity to make real amends. And that the goal is to design objects, environments, etc., that can transmit liberatory joy to the body and community. So now let me take a turn to talk about dismantling the racist bias in design. So again, shout out to Anna Aggie in terms of the beautiful illustrations, and Sadie for the beautiful mandala. So there's this thing that I talk about, the European Modernist Design Project. And it's this myth that we told ourselves that design is something that happened in Europe in the 1800s, and that through technological process, the masses may have access to a better life. And by removing our allegiance to ethnic and national markers, one can join a universal humankind. I mean, actually, they said mankind, but, humankind. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of that. I'm going to talk about the second part of this project, which is removing allegiance to ethnic and national markers. One can join a universal humankind, because that is where you see the racist bias in that project. So where does this myth come from? I like to look at world fairs as a way to see into both the rhetoric and the practices of nation building. And in this case, of the sort of origin stories of this European modernist project in design. So I'm going to particularly focus on the Great Exhibition of 1851, which took place in London. And in the description of it, you get a sense of, like, again, this focus on unity of nations, peace and goodwill among various mankind. Again, that sense of what's the role of nature's productions versus human intellect. Again, beginning to see a little bit of things in this language around enlightened people and friendly rivalry. But again, you see that language, right, of promoting unity among nations and peace and goodwill among the various races of mankind. And, to read this is really, quite inspiring. And yet you move 3 pages later, and forgive me for my, fake BBC accent, because I think it's important to read this aloud. The productions of those who commonly call Aborigines, or the less civilized races, are substantially the inferior fruits of human industry. The highly civilized man, rendered by science familiar with the works of uncivilized people, will soon come practically to aid them to acquire the superior qualifications that shall rightfully place them on his level. China and India have so much in common with us in their manufactures, their arts, and their agriculture, and they have made so much progress already in many respects that purely Aboriginal products are comparably few in these countries. They lost me. They lost me. Because you've gone from, again, peace and goodwill among the various races to mankind, to what is described as the great chain of being, where you have highly civilized man, meaning Europeans, at the top. You have China and India, Asia, in the middle. And then, again, those less civilized races who are inferior fruits of human industry, right, at the bottom. And you think, okay, maybe that's just a product of like 1851 thinking. But if you look at the rankings, the QS global rankings of art and design institutions in the world, number 1 is the Royal College of Arts in London. And the top 10 are actually mostly European or European American institutions. You begin to see China and India appear in the list in the 20s and 30s. Again, there is no representation of Africa in the list of African art and design institutions. There's you only begin in the 150s to 200s to be able to see Middle Eastern designs. So again, we think of that as something long ago, but these are the 2023 rankings that still maintain that hierarchy in our notion of what is design. And then we turn to the beloved Bauhaus, which is the pinnacle of that. And I'm not going to read through all this, because what I think is important to take out of this is that the early proponents of the Bauhaus were racist. They believed in the superiority of the white race, and the leadership of the white race against other peoples. And even, let's say, you know, in my generosity, they were focused on being able to address the trauma of white European men who had experienced the horrors of World War I, in their bodies, in their spirits. And so the problem is not that the Bauhaus proponents were white supremacists. Their problem is that we have made that our universal standard for quote unquote good design. Now, that means we've designed a world that fits European white men who've been traumatized by World War I, and anyone, and now actually practically everyone, who is not that, who is not living that experience. Again, the world is not designed with and for them. So the European-derived modernist design project has white supremacy at its roots. And it's a problem because, again, we've made it a universal standard. And what do I mean by white supremacy? Always surprised by the fact that the origins of whiteness has a time and a place. The time was 1681. The place was the Colonial Assembly of Maryland. And what these laws that were passed in 1681, what they sought to do was to break up, separate the alliances that was happening in the Bakers' Rebellion, in which white working class folks who were indentured servants, in alliance with Black free peoples and African enslaved peoples, banded together in order to, in some ways, overthrow their white aristocratic European overlords. Now, again, not pure justice, because they were coming together in many ways in opposition to indigenous communities. But the response to that solidarity, Black and white solidarity, was these passing of these laws, which became the first anti-miscegenation laws. So again, starting in 1681, white people were no longer to marry people of African descent or members of native tribes. They were no longer able to set free enslaved peoples. Free Blacks were not able to hold public office. The beating or whipping of Christian white servant naked without a special order of the justices of the peace. Again, enslaved Africans and free Blacks were not allowed to have guns. So in order to separate Black whiteness, they pushed down the quality of life for those who are of African descent, for those who are indigenous, Native American heritage, and again, didn't uplift the lives of indentured Europeans. It just pushed everyone else's lives down, so that, again, indentured Europeans would see that they have greater alliances with their aristocratic European overseers than with everyone else. The thing that this has meant in terms of white supremacy in design is that othered bodies have been omitted from the design. consideration. And this is the case of like the design in the medical field, the design in the education field, like there's serious implications for this. But there is the work that's being done in order to bring, in this case, gendered bodies back. So these are just some of the books that are being released that are bringing gendered bodies back into design. So Invisible Woman, Women by Carolyn Credo Perez, who actually documents deep life and death implications of the exclusion of gendered female, non-binary gendered bodies and how we design policy in the world. Again, that there are those who are doing the work to bring bodies with disabilities into the understanding of who we're designing for. And these are some of the books that are recently and has historically been published around universal design, inclusive design, design for belonging. Last 5 years, there have been lots of books, including mine, that's about bringing Indigenous and racialized bodies back into the fore. So the Black Experience in Design, an anthology of Blackness, the Indigenous Present. But it's not just about bodies. What we really need to dismantle in many ways is white supremacy culture. So Tema Onkun has done wonderful work on understanding white supremacy as a culture. So it's not just about the embodiment in white bodies. We all are swimming, they say, in white supremacy culture. So it's about changing the values. Instead of progress being bigger and more, seventh generation thinking. Instead of being fearful of open conflicts, we go into conflict resolution. Instead of being quantity over quality, we focus on values and processes. Instead of thinking there's only one right way, we recognize that there are different paths. So the Modernist Design Project has excluded and continues to exclude those across race, gender, class, body and able-mindedness, Christian religion, non-European heritage. And our real work is changing the values of white supremacy that underlines these designs. And that work is being done. So the takeaway is that white folks must do the work of healing their own intergenerational trauma, that those of us excluded must continue to claim and reclaim our stories of making, and we have to cede space and power to those who are non-white, male, able bodies, Christian, et cetera, because the ways of working that has been oriented around patriarchy and white supremacy culture is killing everyone. And so some of the places to do that work, I'm offering actually this summer some courses through CalArts, extended studies. There's a course on exploring whiteness without white supremacy, hiring for decolonization and cultural justice, and then business transformation through cultural appreciation and not appropriation. And so these are kind of, again, very tangible ways to begin to do some of that work. So thank you. This is Decolonizing Design, meaning putting Indigenous first, dismantling the tech bias and racist bias in European Modernist Project, making amends through more than diversity, inclusion, and equity, and reprioritizing existing resources to decolonize. And so if you have any more questions, feel free to contact me by email, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And I look forward to in addressing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dori. This was I was taking copious notes. Lots and lots to process here. And I know we've had a couple of comments in the chat. I didn't know. Elaine, do you want to join us in lifting up some of those comments? And let me introduce Elaine Hightower, who leads our AP program here at Partnership for Southern Equity. Thanks so much for helping us out here.
Hi, everyone. Let's see. What strategies can be used to heal the intentional divide between Black and Indigenous people, especially in correcting our relationship to land in the context of land back? How can we better work together?
I have a very, so I say, I have a very concrete example of something that I wish had happened in terms of, let's say, reparations. So here, I don't, in the Los Angeles area, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of press about the fact that actually the like Manhattan Beach had actually was established, right, by well, first it's like Chumash lands, doing that, but that they had taken the land of a Black family, and they had given the lands back, right? So this is 2020, everyone's making reparations. They actually gave the land back. And the family had decided to actually take $20 million for the land because they did the research, and like there's a fire station already on it. There's all these things, like it's been built up, right? So it's a thing. They're like, well, it's like it's going to take whatever to tear it down and build whatever that we want to build on it. So their decision was like, okay, the market value of the land was $20 million. Now, again, this is the thing where, 40 acres and a mule, yes, the Black family has gotten it, but there's nothing that has been like what I wish they had done is like, okay, we'll take the 20 mil. And, even if they want to say we'll give 10 mil to like Indigenous community organizations and the Chumash peoples, right? Because actually, again, it's like, it is the Indigenous people's lands. Right? It is Tongva land, it's Chumash lands, it's these people's land. And so this is the part where there's things that I wish could happen in the sense of by putting Indigenous first, and to the extent that there is, let's say, reparations that are brought to the Black community, that we are understanding that even our relationships to the land, right, are are complicated, right, by the fact that even if our ancestors were involuntarily brought through, and that is not even the case for those who, again, who've recently immigrated, right, to the United States, Canada, or whatever, that they're occupying that space of more settlers where they're choosing, again, to leave their homelands in order to build a better life on Indigenous lands. So the strategy is pretty simple, is first recognize that wherever we are, we're on Indigenous lands. And then again, make restitution be of service, right, to Indigenous communities, be of service to their goal for self-determination. Give the land back in one way or another. And you're beginning to see this, like in Berkeley, there's a parking lot that was there, and they're giving it back to the Indigenous peoples of the lands there. So there's ways to reframe our relationship to the land as guests, as visitors, right? Has the fear, when I talk to people about like what's the fear of experiencing Indigenous sovereignty, the fear is that Indigenous people will get together, put us all back on boats, and ship us all back home. And I've yet to meet one Indigenous person who has said that is their vision for decolonization. All of them have said, in other ways, we just want to be able to share the land. We just want to have enough land to be able to practice our culture and our language and rebuild for our next generations, our stories and ways of making and ways of thinking. And you can be a part of that as a guest, right? And the best way that you be a good guest is to be of service, right? If the fear is they're going to put you, if you are useful, again, Indigenous communities will want to have you around to be useful. right? If you are helping to take care of the land, if you're helping to take care of the future generations, you are a part of that community. So the way to address the fear is to be in solidarity with the Indigenous struggle, to learn. When I talk about decolonizing design, for me, the design part is important because it gives us a tangible world in which we begin to feel comfortable living under the principles of Indigenous sovereignty. And again, in the case of like you know, Toronto, where I was, the Haudenosaunee, like they're the 7 grandfather teachings. This is like love, respect, bravery. These are values that we want to live on. When I was in Australia, it was respect, know, care, and share. These are values. These are good values that we could be living under, instead of this separation and oppression and extraction and greed. So again, I just try to be a good guest. And like I said, I mess up all the time. But because I'm in community and because I'm in relations, like they will call me out as an act of love. My Indigenous colleagues will call me out as an act of love because they're trying to say, we want to be in good relationship with you. So stop doing the things that is causing harm in us building a harmonious relationship. You should only be worried when people are silent, right? If they are telling you this is what's hurting me, please let's figure out a way for you to stop doing that. Get what you need. Let's just find a different way to do it. Like that is an act of love. And I say Indigenous people have been extraordinarily loving because they have been telling us this is what we need to do to make amends. This is what we need to do. And we just need to do the work. And that's the self-work, knowing where you're coming from, knowing your histories, right? Knowing your triggers. But it's also like the work of being in community, being in true community and love and respect and understanding and care, which again, these are like beyond human necessities for us to survive the planet that we're on.
Thank you for that. Let's see, we have another question. What is the best way to increase Indigenous, Black, POC representation in design spaces, careers after university? What frameworks need to be set up for success?
Well, actually, I'm writing right now, actually, like I said, an article for Fast Company where I've been doing interviews with all of these organizations that have been, I say it's like building design finishing schools, in the sense of like, even if you have some, so the thesis of the thing is that Indigenous, Black, and POC communities generally have less early access to design. They have less access to design mentors. They have less access to just resources like maker spaces and things like that. So what these organizations have done is that they have one wing, which is like going to the schools. And by schools, this is like, you know, K through 12, but also universities, because let's say there's not a lot of necessarily design programs. And design for me is important because design is while we remake the world, right? Design is how we remake the world. So how we, getting more people involved, but what they found is even when they've gotten more people involved and set up these spaces for them to engage with making, again, to have exposure to, let's say, the rules of corporate life that they need to be able to address. So now they've set up, in some ways, like I said, these like design finishing schools where it's like, this is what you need to have in your portfolio. This is how you set up and do an interview. This is what you need to do in order to like negotiate your salary. This is what you need to do to transition into leadership. So they've done all this mentorship of young people in order to help them make these transitions, because there may not be people in their family or immediate circle who could guide them through those processes. And to the extent that like design is still like 70% white, like they just have more people available to who experience and access and can guide and mentor them through that. So there's in Texas, there's Youth 4. In Cleveland, there's Design Explorer. In the Bay Area, there's Interact. There's all these different ones that are actually Chicago, there's Project Osmosis. So there's all these different ones that are actually, again, hooking youth, and youth is like, 10 to 29, hooking up youth with design to make that transition, particularly from university into professional life. And again, it's a thing where at OCAD University, we had an entire unit, the Center for Emerging Artists and Designers, that was doing that work. It just now, again, not all institutions have that. And so these organizations are doing the work to make sure that Indigenous, Black, and POC youth have access to that.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's all the time we have for questions. I'll pitch it back to Suzanne to close us out.
Oh, excuse me, mute. Thank you so much, everyone, for chiming in with your questions and some really thoughtful comments in the Q&A. I encourage everybody to take a look at that before you hop off. And there were a couple of good links that were shared for some resources as well. Dr. Tunstall, we are so grateful for all that you've shared today. I know that we will all leave this with a lot of new thoughts in our heads to sort of sort and inspire some different paths forward for us, and questions to ask in our work. So thank you so much for being with us. We hope that we will see you again in other opportunities to come together with folks in this sort of emerging community of practice. And we wish you the best in your ventures.
Thank you so very much. Be well and be safe all.
Thank you all. Oh, Elaine, the date for the next webinar. Sorry, we had a closing thought. Just wanted to make sure that folks are blocking their calendar for our next one.
May the 22nd will be our next webinar, and we also want you to stay tuned for an asynchronous course of the Just Communities AP Foundations course. Thank you.
Yay. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.